Mark Carney has 3 passports: Canada, United Kingdom, Ireland. A globalist with options. He hasn't seen Canada in a decade. Calls himself a European, not a Canadian.
As a European, I am a European, actually.
Oh, you are?
Yeah, I'm a citizen.
Told U.S. Congress last year he's a Brit. He's back to lord over you. Canada's not his home. It's his throne.
I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. We have a great episode for you today, and I'm very pleased to be joined by one of my favorite guests from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I'm talking about Franco Terrazzano, and he is here to help us make sense of the different political parties' platforms. We talk a lot about politics on the show. We don't always talk about policy, and so I'm hoping that Franco can help us shine light on what differentiates the two parties. So Franco, welcome to the show.
Hey, Candice, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and you are the author of a new book called Axing the Tax, The Rise and Fall of Canada's Carbon Tax. I'm going to ask you about that book in a few minutes. But first, I'm wondering if you could help us understand what are the key policy platforms introduced. Let's start with the Conservatives. So can you walk us through what you think are the most important policies that they've introduced so far?
Well, let me just say, being with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, I'm definitely happy to see all the tax cuts that are coming into play here during the election. And, Mr. Poilievre and his Conservatives, he's offering some much needed tax relief. And I think some tax changes that could really supercharge Canada's economy. But let's start with the income tax cuts, right? So Mr. Poilievre is proposing to cut the lowest income tax rate by 15%. Okay, so that would save your 2-income family up to about $1,800 a year. Right? So that's good news, because here's the thing. Life is so unaffordable. I know a lot of media talking heads want to talk about everything else, but look, the cost of living crisis is still here, and keeping $1,800 in a family's budget every single year is big time savings, right? And look, the best way the government can help Canadians deal with all aspects of life in terms of affordability is just let us keep more of our own money. Right? And Poilievre's income tax cut would do just that. But Candice, let's talk about actually growing our economy here for a second. And this is a really interesting policy promise from Poilievre. He wants to defer capital gains taxes. So if you sell an asset and then you reinvest that money back into Canada, well, you're not going to be paying capital gains taxes on that when you make that reinvestment. So I think that is a huge policy announcement to actually grow our economy, to encourage more reinvestment back here in Canada. And, Jack Mintz, a very reputable economist, he says that could put $90 billion into Canada's economy over the medium term, lead to more than 200,000 new job opportunities for Canadians. So that's a huge move.
It is. My husband and I were talking about this the other day, and what a sort of exciting opportunity to reinvest in Canada, and how much money that would encourage. We're talking about big companies wanting to reinvest in the country, big investors, rather than taking their money, investing into the United States, like we saw Mark Carney do at Brookfield, encouraging more people to do it at home. It's interesting, Franco, because over the last few years under the Liberals, they've sort of sold us on two major taxes, right? First, the carbon tax, what they told us was going to help us lower emissions and lead the way into a greener future. And then the second one, more recently, was the capital gains increase. And we were told by Justin Trudeau and the Liberals that it was time that the wealthy paid their fair share, and that it was only going to impact, 2% of Canadians or something like that. And interestingly, I don't think the Liberals are standing by either of those two taxes at this point. So tell us what's happening over on the Liberal side.
Well, the capital gains tax is more clear, right? So after massive pushback from doctors, tech entrepreneurs, and of course your friends here at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, the Liberal government backed down on their own capital gains tax. And Candice, remember what was actually happening here? Because you'll remember back in January, Trudeau prorogued the House, right? Prorogued Parliament, shut Parliament down. Well, at that point, they were still going ahead with this capital gains tax increase, even though the necessary legislation wasn't even brought into the House. It wasn't debated. It wasn't passed into law. It wasn't proclaimed. And yet you still had these unelected bureaucrats at the CRA trying to take billions of dollars from Canadians through this undemocratic an illegal capital gains tax hike. And that's why the Canadian Taxpayers Federation took the government to court. A week after our court challenge, the government backed down. And now Mark Carney, the Liberal Party leader, he says he's not going to go forward with this capital gains tax increase. So, I guess that's some pretty good news. Canadians pushing the government back on their own tax increase. Now, Candice, the carbon tax, though, is a little bit trickier. It's a little bit sneakier, right? So what Carney did, you all remember him signing that order in council in front of the media. Well, all he did is he brought the consumer carbon tax rate down to 0. But Candice, there's 2 things to keep an eye on. Number 1, the carbon tax law is still on the books. Okay, so after the election, after those politicians are done singing for their supper, they could come back into the House of Commons and crank that carbon tax back up. The second thing, though, Candice, we can get into this in a little more details, is that Carney isn't ending all carbon taxes. He wants to change the carbon tax. He wants to impose huge hidden carbon taxes on Canadian businesses, and he hopes you won't notice when that makes your life more expensive.
Well, I mean, I guess on the one hand, it's good that the Liberals are finally seeing the light, that part of the reason that our economy is in such rough shape is because of the damaging policies they put in place. And, I mentioned that they sell it as, oh, we're just going to make the rich pay their fair share. But when you tax capital gains, what you're really doing is punishing people who innovate, people who take risks, create businesses, try to add value to something. And by penalizing them, you're just telling you're telling like young men across the country, rather than starting a business, like don't even bother because you're just going to be taxed to no end. And so I think, the fact that everyone stepped away from this is a really good sign. I applaud you and your organization for taking the government to court. It's so unbelievable what they've tried to do. And I am really excited about the Conservatives' idea there to allow people to reinvest and defer capital gains tax. I think you're right. The carbon tax is a little bit more you don't really know what's happening. What you see isn't what you get, because Mark Carney believes in this stuff, right? This is who he is. Everything about him is based on his belief in net zero, in creating a green new economy, in trying to promote the never-ending grift, which is green energy. And it's just a matter of time before they introduce something else, right? They believe so firmly in this idea that we're going to just magically create a new source of energy and that all we need is just more government subsidies for it. So I'm wondering, Marco, like what else have we seen from the Liberals that are promoting this sort of idea of a new green economy or a green shift?
Well, Carney's been pretty wobbly on that oil and gas cap, right? Production cap, to say the least. I mean, look, they've supported their own production cap on Canada's oil and gas sector. I mean, they're the ones who brought it in. They have supported it for quite some time now. And look, so I think Canadians have every reason to have trust issues with the Liberal Party, both on carbon taxes, but then all the other different energy regulations, right? Like the No More Pipelines law, Bill C-69. They brought in the discriminatory tanker ban on the West Coast. I remember this was the government that rejected the Northern Gateway pipeline, that moved the regulatory goalposts on Energy East pipeline, right? So like Canadians, taxpayers have every reason to be extremely skeptical. But like, let's also not lose sight of the carbon tax issue. It hasn't gone away. Life is still unaffordable. And again, like here's a huge wedge. Mr. Poilievre and the Conservative Party is the only major federal party that has committed to ending all carbon taxes, getting rid of the consumer carbon tax, ending that law, but also ending the hidden industrial carbon tax that hits oil and gas companies, refineries, utilities, fertilizer plants. And look, Carney is trying to sell people these magical beans, right? Carney's essentially saying, don't worry, folks, it's just going to be the businesses who pay for that. But like, come on. Here's the thing. When you carbon tax a refinery, that makes gasoline and diesel more expensive, right? When you carbon tax utilities, that makes home heating more expensive. When you carbon tax fertilizer plants, well, that increases costs for Canadian farmers and it makes food more expensive. And Candice, just one thing. Now, we're all talking about Trump and the US. Well, guess what? The United States does not have a national carbon tax. So if Carney hammers businesses in Canada with this carbon tax, what's going to happen? It's going to push Canadian businesses to cut production in Canada, set up shop south of the border. So it means higher prices for Canadians and fewer jobs for Canadians.
Well, not just that, but we've talked about this on the show before, that the retaliatory tariffs that Mark Carney is imposing on the Americans is actually a tax paid by Canadians. So when they say a 25% tax on American goods, that's American goods imported into Canada and purchased by Canadians. It's a tax on us. It's a 25% tax on us. I wish that more Canadians would understand that and that the media would say it plainly. A tariff is a tax, and the tax on American goods is a tax on Canadians.
Hey, couldn't have said it better myself. Let me just add one more thing. The government of Canada knows that simple reality because there's billboards from the government of Canada in the United States saying that a tariff is a tax on Americans. Okay, well, if a U.S. tariff is a tax on Americans, the converse is also true, right? A Canadian tariff is a tax on Canadian businesses, which means higher prices for Canadians. And look, if Washington, D.C. wants to hit Americans with new taxes, it doesn't mean that Ottawa should hammer Canadians with new taxes. In fact, we should be doing the exact opposite. We got to be cutting income taxes, cutting business taxes, cutting capital gains taxes, and cutting the regulations that make it nearly impossible to invest and actually build stuff here in Canada.
Absolutely. Well, maybe we should invest in some billboards in the GTA, reminding swing voters in Ontario that the tax introduced by Carney is a tax that they will pay. Okay, I want to ask you, because the polls have shown us that, I mean, not all seniors, not all baby boomers are in the wrong. I know, like, a significant portion of them support the Conservatives. The ones watching this channel right now most likely are going to go out and vote for Pierre Poilievre. But what we have seen from polling is that older Canadians and baby boomers are leaning more towards the Liberals, leaning more towards Mark Carney. And that's why I was interested to see the Conservatives introduce a new tax cut for seniors. So why don't you help us understand that?
Yeah, and look, I think this is a good move. So essentially what Poilievre is proposing is to expand the tax-free portion of a working senior's income by another 10 grand, right? So like, think about a working senior. They're working because they're struggling to pay the bills, right? They're working because they're struggling to actually enjoy their golden years. So allowing a working Canadian senior to keep $10,000 more of their income tax-free, like, that's a good move, because we're talking about people, if you're working in your golden years, one, you might just want to keep working, keep busy. That's awesome. But I think for a lot of the working seniors, they're doing so because they're just having a tough time struggling to afford the necessities of life. And that's why I think Poilievre's move, which would expand the tax-free portion of working seniors' income by 10 grand, I think that's a pretty good move. Hey, speaking of seniors voting in this election, let me bring up another thing here, okay? So in Canada, we currently don't have home equity taxes, which are essentially just capital gains on the sale of your primary residence. We don't have that here in Canada yet. And here's why I say yet, for two reasons. In 2016, Trudeau brought in a reporting requirement with the CRA. So when you sell your home, because of Trudeau, as of 2016, you got to tell the CRA how much you made off the sale of that home. Now, why is the reporting requirement in place? Is the CRA just curious? No, I don't think so. That was the first step towards a home equity tax in Canada. Not just that, Candice. The Trudeau government spent hundreds of thousands of our tax dollars funding and promoting a report pushing for new home taxes. So in this election campaign, I hope the media, I hope journalists ask Mr. Carney, do you oppose home equity taxes? Are you thinking about bringing in home equity taxes? And if you actually oppose home equity taxes, are you going to prove it by removing Trudeau's 2016 reporting requirement?
Right. Well, that's such a good point. I remember hearing about that. I'm glad you raised it. Well, Marco, tell us a bit, because both the major parties, the Conservatives and Liberals, have put out housing reports. They both have identified a lack of housing as a major concern, especially in cities like Toronto and Vancouver. And, to me, the policies look a little similar, other than the fact that Mark Carney came out saying that he wanted to put government back in the business of building homes. I don't know who's out there asking for more government involved in housing.
Oh,
It seems to
my.
me the exact opposite. But when you look at the fine details, his plan is to build rental homes so that Canadians can be more dependent on a landlord and rent. And when you read between the lines, it seems like he wants to work with a big private company in order to do this public-private partnership. All signs are pointing towards Brookfield as potentially a partner that he might make a deal with, which is really quite concerning. But I want to ask you, what do you think about the two parties' housing platforms, and how can we really distinguish them?
Well, let me just talk about that proposal from Carney that you mentioned there. Like, first of all, folks, government is not the solution to homes, okay? Government is the problem. If more government meant more homes, everyone in Canada would have 7 homes by now, right? Because the size, cost, and intervention of governments across Canada into the housing market has gotten insane, okay? So we don't need more government busybodies. We need less. Now, on the tax side, Candice, so you're right. They're somewhat similar, but I will say on the home tax cuts, edge to Mr. Poilievre. Right. So what Carney's proposing is he wants to eliminate the sales tax. I believe the threshold is up to $1 million, but it's for first time home buyers. Now, for Mr. Poilievre, he increases the threshold, so cut the sales tax off of homes up to about $1.3 million. And that's for everyone, not just first-time home buyers, right? So look, edge to Mr. Poilievre on that tax cut proposal. Now, here's another thing I will say, because we talked about the home equity tax flirtations from the Trudeau government. Mr. Poilievre, not during this campaign, but he's been on the record. So on the Canadian Taxpayers podcast, I just asked Poilievre point blank, would you remove that reporting requirement with the CRA? And Mr. Poilievre said he would. So nice. There you go, folks.
Wow, that's great. Good job on that. Okay, Marco. Sorry, Franco. I did want to ask you about the NDP, because they're also running in this election. I know the polls show that they might be completely wiped out. I asked you if you've been tracking what they've been saying. You said not really, because I don't know that they're really saying much or proposing much. I mean, it could be a situation where they hold the balance of power once again if it's a Liberal minority government. So is there anything we should be looking out for from the NDP?
Yeah, I think the thing to watch out for is just their unrealistic spending plans. Like, they want to spend more money on everything forever, right? And like, look, the government is already more than $1 trillion in debt. You have a simple fact of life now that interest charges on the debt are blowing a $1 billion hole in the budget every single week. Candice, what's $1 billion? Well, $1 billion, that's a new hospital. Every week that is gone because of the interest charges on the debt. And so watch out for the new Democrats just like announcing these crazy spending plans, because you have to remember, folks, that we're not living in a vacuum. We're living in a situation where you had the government's money printer running on overdrive for how many years, which shot up the cost of living. We're in a situation where the debt is already more than $1 trillion. Candice, here's a crazy stat. Welcome to Canada, where every single dollar you pay in federal sales tax is going to pay interest on the debt. Okay, so folks, stay on guard for the new Democrats' spending proposals, and just remember, no, we are broke. We can't be spending more money on everything forever. We got to cut spending. We got to cut the bureaucracy so we can cut taxes to make life in Canada more affordable and to allow our businesses to compete better, especially on the international stage.
Well, I couldn't have said it better myself, Franco. Okay, tell us about your new book, Axing the Tax, The Rise and Fall of Canada's Carbon Tax, which is available now on Amazon. Tell us about the book. There you go.
Axing the Tax. Look at that. Look at that pretty front page cover, folks. Axing the Tax. So I wrote the book for 2 reasons. Number one is I just think ordinary Canadians deserve some credit here, right? Because look, this was truly a David versus Goliath story, where for years you had the talking heads in the media, right? All the big smart people around Ottawa or Toronto telling Canadians to sit down, be quiet, and pay your carbon tax bills, okay? For years, these politicians, these bureaucrats, these big government activists have been pushing carbon taxes on the people. And like, look, it would have been easier for the people just to have given up, just to say, okay, enough is enough, take my money. But that's not what happened. Ordinary Canadians worked their butts off, organized rallies, went to rallies, put up bumper stickers, emailed their politicians, convinced people in their neighborhoods that the carbon tax was a bad idea. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book. Just people need to know that they fought hard for a very long time and they deserve some credit with the carbon tax on death's doorstep right now. The second reason, though, Candice, is like, look, you can already hear the carbon tax activists trying to spin this. They're going to try to say the carbon tax was a good idea. Trudeau just bungled the policy or he didn't communicate it well enough. And none of that could be further from the truth. The carbon tax always was, always will be a bad deal for Canadians, a bad idea. And this book shows you where the fight is heading next to end all of the carbon taxes in Canada.
Well, I want to just highlight something you said, that the media basically just told us that we had to be good citizens, be good little Canadians, pat us on the head, pay the carbon tax, and basically just lie and cover for the Trudeau government for years upon years. And then when Mark Carney agrees to scrap it, just following what the Conservatives are doing, basically trying to neutralize the issue, what did we see? The media out there celebrating Mark Carney, pointing out how the gas prices are down and doing a victory lap on behalf of the Liberals. It was so sickening. Canadians, don't fall for it, okay? That was the same media that was shaming you and telling you to be obedient and pay the tax. So congratulations, Franco, on a great book. And everyone go out and buy a copy, support Franco and the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Any last word, Franco?
Yeah, look, you can get Axing the Tax. I think you're going to like it. It's a big history. There's a lot of political spice in there that hasn't been released to the public. So if you like politics, you like history, I think you're going to like this book, Axing the Tax. You can get it on Amazon. But look, folks, you deserve so much credit fighting back against really the elites around government against their carbon taxes. But like, I'm just going to say it right now, the fight against carbon taxes is not over. The law is still on the books. Got to watch out for that. And not to mention, Carney still wants to impose a hidden carbon tax on Canadian businesses, which will mean higher prices for you and fewer jobs for Canadians.
Well, everyone go out and buy that book and support the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Franco Terrazzano, thank you so much for joining the show. All right, folks, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back again tomorrow with all the news. I'm Candice Malcolm. This is the Candice Malcolm Show. Thank you and God bless.